It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here today and to receive this fantastic award. I feel as though, this isn't for me, but for everybody in this room. This is an award that anybody who has spoken out and acted in a manner which is reflective of, no problem, I'm trying to hold on my concentration here. I was sort of hoping for the Jimi Hendrix feedback. So then I would have known that I had truly made it.
He was a Marine too.
There's a lot of people who serve their country honorably, and I think the gentleman who said, veterans for peace, it's a little bit repetitive because all veterans should be for peace. Because if you are a veteran of a military experience, then you understand, A, what it means to serve your country.
Hey.
B, that sometimes this service requires the ultimate sacrifice to be made. And C, having survived that service and having avoided making that ultimate sacrifice, you understand how precious life is and why we should never get involved in experiences that require our veterans to be put in a position to make the ultimate sacrifice unless it truly is the last recourse.
Yeah.
We all can play political games. One of the easiest one to play is to say, hey, I want to compare the military record of John Kerry with George W. Bush. And that one's sort of easy. I'll compare the military record of anybody in this room with George W. Bush. And you don't have to be a combat veteran to be a veteran. You don't have to be the person walking point or the machine gunner or the fighter pilot. The fact is, when you look at the modern military today, there's very few people who are the rifleman on point, the machine gunner, the fighter pilot, the gunner in the tank. Modern military doesn't work that way. There's a lot of people that provide support. There's logisticians, there's administrators, there's the cooks, the bakers, the candlestick makers, and yes, indeed, there are even those self-contradictory personnel labeled military intelligence. That's what I am, a military intelligence officer. I served for 12 years in the Marine Corps, and I served proudly in times of war and peace. Not a combat hero who's jumped out of airplanes into, a landing zone, but I'm one of these people who's had the opportunity to observe war from a distance. And I have to tell you, it doesn't get any prettier the further back we get. One of the things, though, that being an intelligence officer has provided me is the ability to serve my country not only as an active duty person in the Marine Corps, but also as an extension of my government's policies by serving as an intelligence official in Iraq for 7 years, overseeing the disarmament of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. And it's through that service that I was blessed or cursed. It's up to you to determine what it is. Sometimes it seems like a blessing to me, sometimes it seems like a curse. But I was given this unique experience to observe firsthand, as a key player, what was going on in regards to the disarmament of Iraq. That's not a pretty story. Nothing ever is. The world is not black and white, and I can tell you that the issue of disarming Iraq was not one of black and white. It was definitely gray. It was multifaceted. It was extraordinarily complex. But at the end of the day, it's one that allowed anybody who was involved intimately with this process to make certain conclusions. A, that Iraq had not lived up totally to its obligations regarding disarmament. Now, these obligations are many. They go well beyond simply getting rid of weapons of mass destruction. So I was somebody who always believed that we still had a process of weapons inspection to complete in Iraq before we could call the job done. And I spoke out aggressively for the United States to honor its commitment to the weapons inspection process by ensuring that the weapons inspectors receive the full support of the United States and the Security Council in implementing the provisions of Security Council resolutions calling for disarmament. Now, a lot of people took that position to mean that I wanted to bomb Iraq into the Stone Age. Far from it. I'm somebody who believes, though, that if you pass a law, you better enforce the law. So if you're going to say Iraq must disarm, you set the conditions of that disarmament, and Iraq chooses not to comply, there must be an enforcement function. But I'm also someone who believes in due process. And in the same way that we would not tolerate our police here at home, or we should not tolerate our police at home, from carrying out illegal searches and seizures or violations of individual civil liberties when prosecuting a criminal investigation, we should not allow the United States, or any nation for that matter, to use Security Council resolutions which carry the weight of not only international law, but ladies and gentlemen, I need not remind these people in this audience today, the Constitution. Article 6 of the United States Constitution is quite clear that when our nation has entered into an international treaty or obligation that has been ratified by 2/3 of the United States Senate, that is the supreme law of the land. So when we sign the Charter of the United Nations, when we commit to endorsement and implementation of the rule of law as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations, when we sit as a permanent member of the Security Council and we vote in favor of a Security Council resolution calling for the disarmament of Iraq, that's what we should do. But that's not what happened. You see, we had a secret policy of regime change, getting rid of Saddam Hussein, one that had been in place since 1991, the same year that we said we wanted to disarm Iraq. And I found myself in a position as a weapons inspector where I wasn't being allowed to disarm Iraq, not only because Iraq was failing to comply, but more importantly because my country, the United States of America, was implementing a secret policy of regime change that required that Iraq never be found to be in compliance. So it doesn't matter if we succeeded or if Iraq rolled over and gave us everything we wanted, we would never be allowed to achieve that final end result of compliance, because to do so meant that you'd have to lift economic sanctions that were linked to Iraq's compliance. And if you lift economic sanctions, you've broken containment of Saddam Hussein. It becomes very difficult to get rid of the dictator. My government had no intention of allowing the rule of law, of allowing a non-violent resolution to a difficult problem to take place. Instead, they sought regime change. Well, we've seen the effects of regime change. We've gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, but we did so in a way that has shredded the credibility of our country, disgraced the sacrifice made by those Americans who have given their lives and have been wounded in Iraq, that has shamed every single one of us as citizens, that has destroyed the viability of international law, and frankly speaking, destroyed the viability of American democracy. So we can't call ourselves... representatives of a viable democracy, a representative democracy, if we, the people, aren't willing to stand up and fight for what we stand for what represents us, for what defines us. And the answer to what defines us is actually quite simple. It's that which everyone who has served in military or as in civilian capacity, everyone who has served this country, this great country, has taken an oath to. Not to a president, not to Congress, not to a flag, not to any symbol, but to a piece of paper that contains some very humbling words. Words that begin, "We the people of the United States of America," the Constitution of the United States. That is what defines us. That is the one that establishes the values and ideals which we must strive to achieve. And when we look at this war with Iraq, we have failed across the board. The war with Iraq is not just a tragedy for the Americans who have died, for the Americans who have been wounded, for our coalition partners, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, for the tens of thousands of Iraqis who have lost their lives or had their limbs torn asunder by this war. It's a tragedy for all of them, but it's a tragedy for every one of us as well, because the war in Iraq is a manifestation of the failure of this country, the United States of America, to live up to the promise that it has set out, that it will be a nation that represents justice for all. You can't have justice, though, unless it is accompanied with notions of freedom, notions of civil liberty, notions of truth, notions of law. The rule of law, that's what the Constitution's about. Now, we sit here in the political season. We're in the city of Boston. There will be a Democratic National Convention next week. And the likelihood is John Kerry will be anointed as the Democrats' party selection for candidate of the presidency of the United States of America. Now, we compare and contrast the choices that we're going to be facing as American people. We have George W. Bush on the one hand, a man who has failed across the board as commander-in-chief, a man who has failed across the board as an American,